The wind tore sideways across the hill, and Luke Harrison held his jacket closed with one fist as he climbed the last stretch of gravel toward the house. Nobody in Millbrook Lake would go near after dark. Rain came in sheets, hammering the porch roof above him, and the single lit window on the second floor flickered once, twice, then went dark along with every other light he could see down the hillside behind him. He knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, harder, and heard the bolt slide back slow, reluctant, like something being decided one final time. The door opened 3 inches, held by a chain, and in the sliver of candlelight stood a woman with tired eyes and a face that had clearly practiced being unreadable for a very long time. She looked at him for a long moment, then something in her expression cracked, just slightly, and she said it quietly, almost to herself. "I hoped you wouldn't listen." Behind her, deeper in the house, a floorboard creaked, though no one else lived there. Luke didn't move. He didn't ask what she meant. He just stood in the rain and waited for her to decide whether to close the door or open it wider. To find out why an entire town warned a grieving father to stay away from the one woman who might have saved it. Stay until the very end. If you've ever felt the pull to trust someone everyone else had already given up on, you already know the ache in this kind of story. And if that's you, we'd love to hear it in the comments before this one's over. There's always a version of this argument in every small town. Whether the people who've lived somewhere their whole lives actually know the truth about their neighbors, or whether they've just agreed, together, to believe the easiest story. 11 months earlier, none of this existed. Luke Harrison was still living in a rented duplex 3 states away, in a town that reminded him, every single day, of a hospital hallway and a set of double doors he never should have had to walk through. His wife, Claire, had died in March, quickly, from something that had no warning signs until it was too late to matter, and by the time the funeral flowers had wilted, Luke understood that staying in that duplex meant raising his daughter Sophie inside a museum of her mother's absence. So when a maintenance supervisor job opened up in Millbrook Lake, small, quiet, tucked against a long gray lake ringed by pine, he took it without asking many questions, packed a U-Haul with Sophie's bed and Claire's box of photographs, and drove north. Millbrook Lake was the kind of town that still had a hardware store instead of a chain, a diner where the waitress knew your order by the second visit, and a community bulletin board outside the post office covered in flyers for potlucks and Little League sign-ups. Sophie, 8 years old and quiet in the particular way children get quiet after losing a parent, seemed to soften slightly in the first weeks. She liked the lake, liked the dock behind their new rental, liked a stray cat that had adopted their porch. Luke took the maintenance job at the town's community center and school buildings, keeping his head down, fixing boilers and gutters and squeaky doors, and he told himself that was enough. He didn't need more than quiet. But quiet, he learned fast, had a shape in Millbrook Lake, and that shape was the house on the hill. He first heard about it from Ed Callahan, who ran the hardware store and who'd sold Luke a new furnace filter, and unprompted, a warning to go with it. "That house up past the Ridge Road," Ed had said, nodding toward the hill visible through his shop window. "You'll want to stay clear of it. Woman up there, Hannah Mitchell, folks don't go near her." When Luke asked why, Ed had just shrugged in the particular way people shrug when they've repeated a story so many times they've stopped remembering whether they ever verified it. "She's not right," he said. "Something happened to her a few years back. Just stay clear. Everyone does." It wasn't just Ed. The waitress at the diner, refilling his coffee, had lowered her voice when Sophie's teacher mentioned the Mitchell place in passing. The school principal, walking Luke through the building on his first day, had gestured toward the hill visible from the parking lot and said, almost cheerfully, "That's the cursed house. In case anyone tells you otherwise, best to let it be." Even the town's mayor, Richard Calloway, a broad, silver-haired man who owned half the lakefront property and greeted every new resident personally with a handshake and a smile, had mentioned it during Luke's welcome visit, folding his hands and saying with practiced gravity, "Hannah Mitchell isn't well, son. Best kept at a distance, for your girl's sake most of all." Nobody said dangerous. Nobody said criminal. They said cursed and unstable and best kept at a distance, and every version of the warning came wrapped in the same soft, concerned tone. The tone people use when they've collectively decided a story is true and stopped asking each other for evidence. Luke noticed that. He'd spent 15 years as a lead structural engineer before switching to maintenance work, and one thing that job had trained into him permanently was a distrust of consensus without inspection. A building could look sound from every angle and still be rotting at a single load-bearing point nobody had checked. People, he suspected, worked the same way. Richard Calloway mattered more than any other name in that town, and everyone knew it. His family had built half of Millbrook Lake's waterfront developments, funded the community center roof Luke now maintained, and sat, unofficially, at the head of every decision the town council made. His son, Trevor Calloway, ran the family's real estate and construction arm, charming and photogenic, the kind of man who remembered your name after one handshake and used it 3 times in the next sentence. Between them, the Calloways were less a family and more a weather system the whole town organized itself around. And on the hill alone lived the one woman the entire town had agreed to stop looking at directly. Luke saw her twice in his first month without meaning to. Once from a distance, walking the tree line behind her property at dusk, and once buying groceries at the general store, standing at the far end of an aisle while the clerk rang her up without meeting her eyes. The way you'd handle something you'd been told was fragile and possibly contagious. She was maybe mid-30s, sharp-featured, dressed like someone who used to care about how she looked and had simply stopped needing to. She didn't look dangerous. She looked exhausted in a way Luke recognized immediately, because he'd seen that exact exhaustion in his own bathroom mirror in the months after Claire died. The exhaustion of someone carrying something too heavy for too long, alone. He didn't approach her. Not then. He had Sophie to think about, a new job to prove himself in, and an entire town's worth of warnings ringing in his ears. But he noticed the way people's voices dropped when her name came up, and he noticed too that nobody, not Ed, not the waitress, not even Mayor Calloway, ever offered a single concrete detail about what she'd actually done. Just the word unstable, repeated so often it had started to sound less like a description and more like an instruction. Then the storm came. It rolled in off the lake on a Thursday evening in late October, faster and harder than the forecast had promised. And within an hour it had knocked out power across the entire west side of town, including the Ridge Road, including the hill. Sophie was already asleep at a neighbor's for a sleepover, safely tucked away from the worst of it, and Luke sat alone in his dark kitchen listening to the wind peel a loose gutter off the eave outside. His own gutter, the one he hadn't gotten around to fixing yet, and he found himself thinking, unbidden, about the house on the hill, alone above the tree line, no neighbors close enough to check on anyone. He told himself it was simple decency. A woman alone in a storm, power out, nobody nearby. You checked on people in a storm, that was just what you did, curse or no curse. He grabbed a flashlight, pulled on his jacket, and drove the 2 miles up the Ridge Road with his wipers on full, telling himself the whole way that he'd just knock, confirm she was fine, and leave. He didn't yet know that the moment she opened that door would be the moment the whole shape of his year quietly changed. 8 months would pass before he understood exactly what she'd meant by the words she said to him on that porch, and by then, the truth she'd been hiding wouldn't just change his life. It would change the entire town's. Before the storm, before the porch, there had been a version of Luke Harrison who tried once to build a life in Millbrook Lake without asking questions. And it was that version of him who nearly lost everything over one moment of simple, decent instinct at his job, a moment that would become the reason half the town started watching him, the same wary way they watched the hill. It happened 3 weeks before the storm, at the community center where Luke worked. The building's east wing had been slated for a renovation funded largely by the Calloway family, part of a new recreation complex Trevor Calloway had been pitching to the town council for months. A project worth, by Luke's understanding, somewhere north of $2 million in state matching funds, contingent on a final structural inspection clearing the existing foundation for the expansion. Luke had spent 15 years as a structural engineer before Claire's death rearranged his priorities, and something in the East Wing's foundation bothered him the moment he saw the plans. A load-bearing wall slated for removal that, in his professional judgment, was doing more work than the original blueprints accounted for. He raised it quietly, the way he raised everything, in a short conversation with the site inspector Trevor Calloway had hired, a young engineer named Danny Reyes, who worked for Trevor's firm and clearly understood who signed his checks. Luke pointed out the discrepancy between the old blueprints and the current structural reality, suggested a second look before anyone signed off on demolition. Danny listened, nodded, said he'd flag it. Nothing happened. 2 days later, in a meeting Luke wasn't invited to, the inspection was approved anyway, and demolition was scheduled to begin within the month. Luke went to Trevor Calloway directly, which in hindsight he understood was the mistake. Not because he was wrong, but because Trevor didn't want to hear it in front of 2 council members who happened to be in his office at the time. Luke laid out the discrepancy calmly, the way he'd laid out 100 technical problems in his old career, using drawings and numbers instead of accusations. Trevor listened with an easy, patient smile, the kind of smile men like him wore when they'd already decided the conversation was decorative rather than necessary. And when Luke finished, Trevor said, in front of both council members, I appreciate the concern, Luke. I really do. But you're a maintenance tech, not our structural engineer, and Danny's already cleared it. I think it's best you stick to your lane here. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't even unkind, exactly. It was worse than that. It was dismissive in the smooth, corporate way that made Luke sound paranoid for having raised it at all. And one of the council members actually laughed. A small, embarrassed laugh, the kind meant to smooth over an awkward moment rather than address it. Luke said nothing further. He'd learned, over 15 years in rooms like that one, that pushing harder after a dismissal like that only confirmed the story being told about you. That you were difficult, that you didn't know your place, that your concern was really just an excuse to matter more than your job title allowed. Word moved through a small town fast. Within a week, the story wasn't that Luke had raised a legitimate structural concern. It was that the new maintenance guy had tried to overrule Trevor Calloway's own engineer and made a scene about it in front of the council. Ed Callahan mentioned it at the hardware store with a raised eyebrow. The school principal asked him, half joking, whether he was settling in okay. Nobody fired him. His job wasn't on the line, not directly. But something shifted in how people looked at him. A faint new wariness layered on top of the wariness they already held for anyone new in town. And Luke understood, with a familiar ache, that once a story starts moving in a place like Millbrook Lake, the facts underneath it stop mattering very much at all. He thought, more than once in that stretch, about Hannah Mitchell on the hill, about the flatness in people's voices when they said her name, and he wondered, though he didn't yet have the details to know how right he was, whether her story had started the exact same way. A person who noticed something true, said it in the wrong room, and got quietly rewritten by the people who couldn't afford for her to be believed. The renovation went forward. Demolition on the east wing load-bearing wall was scheduled for early November, and Luke, unable to do anything more without risking his job entirely, kept his notes, kept the marked-up blueprints in a folder in his truck, and did his work and said nothing more. It's a particular kind of loneliness. Watching something you know to be true get quietly buried by people more comfortable with convenience than with correction. And if you've ever swallowed a warning because speaking louder would have cost you more than staying silent, you already understand exactly what Luke was carrying that month, and we'd be grateful if you shared that feeling with us in the comments, because so many of you watching have lived this exact quiet humiliation yourselves. It was in this state, dismissed, quietly diminished, carrying a folder of blueprints nobody wanted to look at, that the storm rolled in and Luke found himself climbing the hill toward the one house in town everyone had told him to avoid. When Hannah opened the door that chain's width and said, "I hoped you wouldn't listen," Luke didn't yet know the details of what had happened to her 5 years earlier. But something in her voice, flat, resigned, already expecting to be disbelieved, matched something he just felt in Trevor Calloway's office 3 weeks before. And it was that recognition, more than any curiosity about local gossip, that made him stay on the porch instead of turning back down the hill. "My daughter's not here tonight," he said, which wasn't an answer to anything she'd asked, but it was the only way he knew to say, "I'm not afraid of you, and I'm not here to confirm what everyone says. Power's out down the whole ridge. I just wanted to make sure you were all right." Hannah studied him for a long moment through the gap in the door, rain sliding off the porch roof between them, and something in her face shifted. Not trust, not yet, but the first crack in a wall that had clearly been reinforced for years. "You should go home," she said quietly. Nothing good comes from being seen up here. But she didn't close the door. Behind her, he could see, in the flicker of a battery lantern she'd set on a hallway table, stacks of file boxes lining the hall wall, neat and labeled. The kind of organization that belonged to someone who'd once worked with documents for a living and never quite stopped. He would come to understand, in the months that followed, exactly what those boxes contained and exactly why a town full of otherwise decent people had spent 5 years agreeing not to look inside them. But that night, all he understood was that a woman standing alone in a dark house, dismissed by an entire town, had just told a stranger to leave for his own good instead of hers. And something about that, Luke thought, as he drove back down the ridge road through the rain, didn't sound like instability at all. It sounded like guilt aimed in the wrong direction. 6 weeks would pass before Hannah said another word to him beyond a nod at the general store. 6 weeks in which the crack in that door would slowly, carefully, begin to widen. Hannah Mitchell had not smiled at anyone in 5 years. Not really. Not the kind of smile that reached anywhere past the mouth, and she would have told you, if you'd asked, that she'd made her peace with that. What she hadn't made peace with in the 6 weeks after the storm was the small, stubborn presence of Luke Harrison's daughter. It started with the cat. Sophie Stray had wandered further afield than usual one Saturday afternoon and turned up, of all places, at the base of Hannah's Ridge Road, and Sophie, undeterred by a town's worth of warnings she was too young to have fully absorbed anyway, had walked the whole way up looking for it. Arriving at Hannah's gate flushed and out of breath and entirely unafraid, Hannah had come out to find an 8-year-old sitting cross-legged in her gravel driveway, coaxing a cat out from under her porch with a piece of string, chattering to the animal in the unself-conscious way children do. And something in Hannah's chest had gone very still and very strange, watching her. She'd walked Sophie back down partway, keeping a careful distance the whole way, expecting the girl to be wary of her the way everyone in town was. Sophie wasn't. Sophie asked her if she lived alone, and whether she got scared at night, and whether she liked cats. And by the time Luke came jogging up the road looking for his daughter, red-faced with worry, Sophie was mid-sentence describing her third-grade teacher's unreasonable homework policy to a woman the whole town called cursed. Luke apologized. Hannah said it was fine, quieter than she meant to, and something passed between the two adults over the top of Sophie's head. Not romance, not yet, just a mutual, wary acknowledgement that neither of them was what the other had expected. After that, small things kept happening. Sophie asked to visit again. Luke, against every piece of town gossip he'd absorbed, said yes, on the condition they stayed only in the yard, at first, and only in daylight. Hannah found herself, against her own careful instincts, setting out a second mug of tea, some afternoons before Luke's truck had even turned onto the Ridge Road, as though some part of her had started expecting him before she'd consciously decided to. It was on one of those afternoons in mid-December, with Sophie occupied chasing the cat around the yard, that Hannah finally told him. She didn't tell it all at once, and she didn't tell it like a confession. She told it the way people tell things they've rehearsed too many times alone, in an empty house, flat and precise, like reciting facts about someone else's life. 5 years earlier, she said, she'd worked as a compliance officer for the county's Regional Development Authority, the office responsible for reviewing and approving major building permits and funding allocations across 3 towns, including Millbrook Lake. In that role, she'd discovered a pattern. Permits pushed through for Callaway family developments despite failed environmental and structural reviews, county matching funds redirected through shell companies tied to Richard Callaway's associates, inspection reports quietly altered after the fact to clear violations that had originally failed. She'd documented it methodically, the way anyone trained in compliance work would, building a paper trail across 18 months before taking it to the county board. And the county board, stacked in no small part with men who owed their seats to Callaway campaign contributions, had not investigated the Callaways. They had investigated her. Within 2 months of her filing, an anonymous complaint alleged she'd falsified the very documents she'd used as evidence. A claim that was, she said, flatly untrue, but one that only needed to raise doubt, not prove itself, to do its damage. She was placed on leave pending review. The review dragged an interminable 10 months, during which Richard Callaway's allies made certain in the specific way small towns make things certain that everyone who mattered had heard a softened, sympathetic version of the story. Poor Hannah Mitchell. Brilliant once. But the pressure got to her. She made some things up, terrible shame, best to give her space. By the time the county quietly closed the investigation without formal charges, because they couldn't prove fabrication, only because they'd also buried her original evidence in the process, her career, and her name no longer belonged to her. Nobody official ever called her unstable. They didn't need to. The town did that part for them, for free, for 5 years running. I still have everything, Hannah said, nodding toward the hallway, toward those neat, labeled boxes Luke had glimpsed the night of the storm. Every document, every date. I kept it all because I thought someone would eventually want to see it. She looked at him then, steady, no longer flat. Nobody ever did. Until you knocked on my door in a storm you had no reason to climb a hill for. Luke didn't offer comfort, not the easy kind. He sat with what she'd told him for a long moment, and then he told her, quietly, about the East Wing, about Danny Reyes and Trevor Calloway's smooth dismissal in front of 2 council members, about the load-bearing wall he still believed was structurally unsound and that demolition was scheduled to begin on within the month. Hannah's expression changed at that, sharpened, focused, something in her coming alive in a way grief and isolation had clearly kept dormant for years. That's the same wing, she said slowly. That expansion is funded through the same matching fund mechanism I flagged 5 years ago. If they're cutting corners on structure, the same way they cut corners on paperwork. She stopped herself, and Luke watched her weigh something behind her eyes, an old caution warring with something newer. It was Hannah who found the confirmation, 3 days later, cross-referencing an old county filing number against the new community center grant paperwork Luke had photographed from the site office. A filing irregularity nearly identical to the one she'd flagged 5 years before, the same shell company structure, a different year. It wasn't proof of the structural danger itself, but it was proof the same pattern of corner-cutting funding was moving through the same channels, and it meant the load-bearing wall Luke had flagged wasn't a maintenance tech being difficult. It was a second instance of the exact scheme that had destroyed Hannah's career. Word of Luke and Hannah's growing closeness had, inevitably, started moving through town too, and it brought its own quiet cruelty. Ed Callahan mentioning, not unkindly but not gently either, that folks were starting to worry about the new fellow spending so much time up at the Mitchell place, wondering aloud whether it was really wise, with a young girl in the house, to get so close to a woman with her reputation. It was the old debate dressed in new clothes, whether a community's fear of someone was ever really about safety, or whether it was just easier, generation after generation, to let a comfortable rumor stand in for an uncomfortable truth. Luke didn't argue with Ed. He simply stopped mentioning where he spent his evenings. Then, 2 weeks before Christmas, the escalation came. Demolition crews arrived at the community center a full 10 days ahead of schedule, without the follow-up inspection Luke had requested, without any further review of the load-bearing wall at all. Trevor Calloway had pushed the timeline forward quietly, the moment he'd caught wind, through Danny Reyes, most likely, that Luke was asking questions again, this time with someone dangerous standing beside him. Luke stood in the community center parking lot on a gray Tuesday morning, watching an excavator idle beside the east wing, and understood with total clarity that if that wall came down before anyone properly reviewed it, whatever evidence existed of what the Calloways were really funding might come down with it, and there would be no way left to prove either of them right. 4 days remained before the demolition crew's scheduled start. Neither Luke nor Hannah yet knew whether 4 days would be enough. The 4 days moved fast, and Luke spent every one of them the way he'd spent 15 years of his engineering career before Claire died. Quiet, methodical, checking every fact twice before he said a single word out loud. He went first to the county building records office, using his old professional credentials, still technically active, to request the original 1990s structural filings for the community center's East Wing, the filings that predated the version Trevor Calloway's team had used to clear demolition. The discrepancy was exactly what Luke remembered from the blueprints. The wall slated for removal carried load distribution from a roof truss configuration installed during a 2003 renovation, one that never appeared in Danny Reyes's inspection paperwork at all, as though the entire 2003 renovation record had simply been left out of the file Trevor's team worked from. Hannah, meanwhile, went to work on the money. Using the shell company name she'd cross-referenced days earlier, she traced it through 3 layers of county contractor registration filings. Public record, but tedious enough that almost nobody bothered until she found what she'd suspected. The shell company, registered under a name belonging to Trevor Calloway's brother-in-law, had received the matching fund disbursement for the community center project a full 6 weeks before the county's own oversight board had formally approved it, meaning the money moved before the paperwork existed to justify it moving. Exactly the pattern she'd flagged 5 years earlier and been destroyed for flagging. On the 3rd day, Luke brought both sets of documents to the one person in town who'd known fragments of the truth for years and said nothing. Danny Reyes. Danny wasn't a villain, not really. He was a young engineer with a mortgage and a boss who signed his paychecks, and Luke had seen enough of that particular arrangement in his old career to recognize it without contempt. He found Danny alone at the site trailer, going over the demolition schedule, and instead of accusing him, Luke simply laid the missing 2003 renovation filing on the table between them and said, quietly, "You didn't have this when you signed off. I don't think you knew it existed. But I think you should look at it before that wall comes down tomorrow morning." Danny went pale reading it. He'd been told, he admitted, that the original filings had been fully reviewed before he was brought on. Trevor had assured him personally the paperwork was clean. Faced with proof it wasn't, and faced with the very real professional liability of certifying a demolition on a wall he now knew was misclassified, something in Danny finally cracked loose from 5 years of quiet self-preservation. He agreed, shaking, to submit a formal stop work request to the county citing newly discovered structural documentation, a request that, filed by the site engineer himself rather than a maintenance tech or a discredited former compliance officer, could not be as easily dismissed. The stop work order came through with 6 hours to spare before the excavator was scheduled to touch the east wing wall. Trevor Calloway did not take it quietly. Within a day, he was on the phone with the county board, then at the community center in person, demanding to know who had fed Danny Reyes falsified documentation, using the word falsified the exact same way it had once been used against Hannah. Casually, without proof, trusting that the accusation alone would do the necessary damage. He found Luke in the parking lot and, for the first time since Luke had arrived in town, dropped the smooth managerial patience entirely. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Trevor said, low and furious. Close enough that Luke could see the calculation behind his eyes shifting rapidly from confidence to something closer to panic. "You're a maintenance tech playing detective with a discredited lunatic, and it's going to cost you your job." Luke didn't raise his voice. He never did. He simply said, "The filing's a matter of public record now, Trevor. Danny filed it under his own name. That's not something you can make disappear the way you made Hannah's evidence disappear 5 years ago." He watched the words land, watched Trevor's face do something involved and complicated, and then Luke turned and walked back inside, leaving Trevor standing alone by the idle excavator. It was that same week that Richard Calloway, informed by his son of the stop work order and the surfacing documents, made the decision that would ultimately unravel everything. He called an emergency closed-door session of the town council, intending to quietly discredit both the new filing and Hannah Mitchell's name one final time before either could gain traction, and he invited, as a courtesy nobody expected him to extend, the one person whose presence guaranteed the meeting would not stay closed for long: Mayor's office aide and county liaison, and, unexpectedly, town resident Hannah Mitchell herself, whom Richard intended to use as a demonstration, parading her supposed instability in front of the council one more time to preemptively poison any credibility her documents might carry. He miscalculated badly. Hannah walked into that closed session not shaking, not diminished, but carrying 5 years of meticulously organized boxes reduced to a single devastating folder. Dates, filing numbers, the shell company registration, the 6-week gap between disbursement and approval, cross-referenced against the 2003 structural filing Luke had recovered. She laid it on the table in front of the full council, voice level, and said the things she'd waited 5 years to say to people who might finally be forced to listen. I didn't falsify anything 5 years ago. I found exactly what I found today. You simply didn't want it to be true then, and I imagine some of you don't want it to be true now either. The room went silent in the particular way. Rooms go silent when a story that's been comfortable for years suddenly stops being comfortable. One council member, a woman named Patricia Ostrander, who had sat on the board during Hannah's original investigation, and had, Hannah would later learn, quietly voted to accept the settlement that buried her evidence, stared at the documents for a long moment and then said, to the visible fury of Richard Calloway beside her, I want the original 2003 filing pulled and compared publicly. Tonight, if we can manage it. The unraveling had begun, in front of the very people who'd built the wall of silence in the first place. But the meeting ended without a final resolution, tabled for a full public session the following week. A week in which Richard Calloway, cornered and desperate, would have time to attempt one last, considerably more dangerous move to bury the truth for good. The public session was held the following Thursday evening in the Millbrook Lake Community Center's main hall, the same building whose east wing had nearly come down over documents that would have condemned it. And it was. By the time Luke and Hannah arrived, standing room only. Word had moved through the town all week, the way word always did. But this time it had moved the right direction, carrying not gossip but genuine, uneasy curiosity about what exactly their mayor's family had been doing with public money for the better part of a decade. Richard Calloway had tried, in the days between, everything available to a cornered man with money and no remaining good options. He'd pressured Patricia Ostrander to reconsider her public stance, quietly threatened Danny Reyes's firm with the loss of every future county contract, and had his lawyers draft a defamation letter aimed at Hannah that his own attorney, reading the documentation, had quietly advised him not to send. By the night of the public session, he had nothing left but the same performance that had worked for 5 years. Composure, charm, and the practiced assumption that the town would rather believe him than believe her. It didn't work this time. Patricia Ostrander stood first, reading into the public record the original 2003 structural filing alongside the current demolition clearance, the gap between them undeniable to anyone in the room with eyes. Danny Reyes, visibly nervous but resolute, confirmed under direct counsel questioning that he had never been shown the 2003 filing before certifying the project, and that Trevor Calloway had personally assured him the paperwork was complete. Then Hannah stood, and this time she did not recite facts flatly to a room that had already decided not to believe her. She simply laid out, in order, 5 years of buried evidence next to the fresh documentation Luke had helped her recover, and let the paper trail speak for itself. The shell company, the 6-week gap, the pattern repeating exactly as it had before, proof that couldn't be waved away with a soft word like unstable. Richard Calloway attempted once to interject that the timing was suspicious, that a discredited former employee and a maintenance worker had conveniently assembled a narrative together, and it was Mayor Pro Tem's own gavel, along with a wave of visible discomfort rippling through the packed hall, that told him the room was no longer his. By the end of the session, the council voted, 7-2, to refer the matching fund disbursements to the state attorney general's office for formal investigation, and to formally reopen Hannah Mitchell's 5-year-old compliance case with an acknowledgement, read aloud into the public record, that her original findings had been substantially correct and improperly buried. It wasn't a courtroom conviction. It wasn't dramatic in the way people sometimes want justice to be dramatic. But it was, for Hannah, the first time in 5 years that an entire room full of the people who'd once looked away had been forced to look directly at her and admit she'd been right all along, and something in her, sitting in that folding chair with Luke beside her, and Sophie asleep against her shoulder in the back row, finally allowed itself to unclench. In the weeks that followed, the town offered Hannah things. A formal ceremony, a proposed commendation plaque from the council, even, absurdly, an offer from Richard Calloway's own PR consultant to help manage her public reintroduction to the community. She declined all of it, quietly and without bitterness. What she asked for instead, in a short private meeting with the interim county board, was narrower and more permanent. A formal amendment to county compliance procedure, requiring that any employee reporting financial or safety irregularities, be assigned independent legal representation for the duration of any resulting investigation, so that no one else who found the truth would ever again be left as alone as she had been. The board granted it without argument, and the amendment now quietly bears no name at all, exactly as she wanted it. Luke, for his part, was offered his old title back in a different form. The county, embarrassed and eager to demonstrate good faith, offered to reinstate him formally as lead structural consultant on all future municipal projects, a considerable raise attached. He accepted a smaller version of it. Oversight consultant, part-time, enough to keep doing the work he was good at without losing the quieter maintenance job that let him pick Sophie up from school every day at 3. The quiet coda came on an ordinary Saturday in early spring, months after the public session, no cameras, no ceremony. Luke and Sophie had driven up the ridge road, the same road that had once carried nothing but warnings, and found Hannah out on her porch, repainting the door, the same door she'd once opened 3 inches on a chain, now propped fully open, half covered in a fresh coat of pale blue paint. Sophie ran straight past her toward the cat, and Hannah, watching her go, laughed. Not the sad, guarded almost smile she'd worn all those months before, but something open and unguarded and entirely new. Luke sat down beside her on the porch step, and for a while neither of them said anything at all. Just watched a girl chase a cat across a yard that had once belonged to a house nobody in town would go near. "You know," Hannah said eventually, looking at the wet paint drying on the door, "I used to think being right was the only thing that mattered. Turns out having someone believe you while you're still trying to prove it matters a great deal more." Luke didn't answer with words. He just reached over and picked a small fleck of blue paint off her sleeve, and she let him, and that was the whole conversation, and it was enough. If there's someone in your own life who was written off before anyone bothered to really find out why, a neighbor, a coworker, someone the whole room agreed to call difficult or unstable without ever checking the facts underneath it, we'd love for you to tell us about them in the comments, even if it's just to finally give them, here, the credit nobody gave them at the time. And if you believe the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones everyone warned you to stay away from, deserve to be truly seen before it's too late, we hope you'll stay part of this story with us and subscribe, because there are so many more of these still waiting to be told. A door that was once only open 3 inches, on a chain in the rain, now stands painted pale blue and wide open on a hillside. And that, more than any plaque or headline, is what it looks like when the truth is finally, quietly, allowed back inside.